Hello and welcome back. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I'm continuing my Lit 101 series. We're starting in on Beowulf. Now, when I did the Greek and Roman epic poems, I did those in 3 parts. And for Beowulf, I'm going to do this in 4 parts because the poem itself is divided up into 3. So we can do one video on like an introduction and then talking about translation, and then we can do one for each of the 3 sections. But I think we'll need to do a little bit more because I really, really love Beowulf, and so there's going to be lots of yapping on my part. So apologies in advance, but let's dive into this. And there's a cat here, and she really wants my attention, but I'm not giving it to her because I'm a cruel, heartless person. Anyways, so Beowulf. The first question with this one is, I think you ask yourself sort of, why do we still study Beowulf? Like the Greek and Roman stories, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, we can sort of understand why, because those mythological stories are both very foundational to Western thought, Western literature, but we don't really talk about Beowulf as much. Now, we are aware of it. There have been movie adaptations. There's books kind of adapting the story and exploring it. But I feel like Beowulf is one of those ones that's important without us really knowing why it's important, because the germs of the story are in so many things that we read now that we don't even really think about it. Like when we think about Greek and Roman mythology, it's pretty obvious. We're just like, books that retell Greek and Roman mythology, or movies, or even the concept of like the superheroes are very much in line with sort of the Greek and Roman heroes and the gods, and that mythology comes up a lot, and we're aware of it. Even something like, Thor Love and Thunder features cameos by different gods, and we've got Zeus in that one. And so, like, we're aware of the Greek and Roman mythology. But if you're to talk about things in Beowulf, names like Hrothgar, or the concept of Grendel's mother, or the dragon, it's a little more obscure. But once you start digging into it, you see that like Beowulf is sort of one of these foundational texts that's inspired so much that we don't even really think about it. So 3 reasons to study Beowulf. First off, it's cool. Second, it's an important work of literature in terms of the history of the English language, because it's sort of one of the earliest epic things, great works of literature that was uniquely in English. Before that, it was always either other languages. And also, Beowulf just inspires a lot of other people, especially fantasy writers. You'll see a lot of Beowulf's DNA in many other works, especially works like Lord of the Rings. But we'll get into that. So, keeping it really broad here, what is Beowulf? So, it's an alliterative epic poem composed in Old English. It's not set in England, it's set in kind of ancient Scandinavia. But it tells the story of a hero of the Geats, which is a kind of tribe, who comes to the aid of the king of the Danes, Hrothgar, and he defeats a monster called Grendel, and then he defeats Grendel's mother, and then we get a time jump, and we see him as king of the Geats, and he faces off against the dragon and is mortally wounded in the conflict with that. So in a sense, the poem is very much a 2-part epic and then a sequel, if that makes sense. But it was all sort of composed at the same time. And fun fact, the reason that we know about Beowulf is because of one singular copy that we have. It's a document called the Noel Codex. It's from about the 1st century-ish. And it was written by 2 scribes, and you can tell because they have different handwriting, and they have slightly different like ways of writing, slightly different dialects. And so the first half, it kind of cuts off almost mid-sentence, and then the other one sort of takes over. So I don't know if maybe the first scribe died while writing it and then someone else took it up, or if the first one was actually the person who wrote it originally. There's a lot of things we don't know about the origins of it. But we have one document, and it almost perished in a fire in the 18th century, which is horrifying to me. But by then, of course, we would have had other literate scribes during the Middle Ages who would have copied it, and so it would have survived. But that first copy probably wouldn't have, and it's very sad. Now, the Nola Codex also contains some other works. It's not just Beowulf. I think there's also a fragment or a partial version of like an epic poem about the biblical character Judith, and then there's, I think, a English history text as well in there. But Beowulf is sort of in the second document, surrounded by two other things, but it's kind of the earliest version of Beowulf that we have, and we are so lucky to have that, because keeping documents, especially like it was like vellum and parchment and stuff like that, does not survive the centuries easily. And so the fact that we still have it, it's in the British Museum, the fact that we still have it is something of a minor miracle. So be grateful that we have Beowulf, because we almost didn't. I mean, looking back at things like the Odyssey, it's also pretty shocking that we have that as well, because that's much, much older than Beowulf. But the fact that we have Beowulf at all is still something of a mystery, because even things from like the 1800s are easily lost, destroyed, that kind of stuff. There's lots of documents from that era that we've lost. So, you know, I'm very grateful personally that Beowulf exists and that we still have access to it, because we almost didn't, and that would have been a tragedy, because Beowulf is very cool. Now, in terms of the history of Beowulf, some scholars posit that maybe it was an oral poem before it was written down. Others think that it was sort of written down by the person who composed it. And that's a very long, complicated debate, and there's evidence to support sort of both sides of the argument. Another debate that surrounds Beowulf that's kind of linked to that is whether or not it existed before the Christian elements were added, because there are sort of Christian bits and pieces in the story throughout. Now, if it was an oral tradition beforehand, then it would have been like a pagan Scandinavian poem before that, and then whoever wrote it down would have then sort of added the Christian elements in, because the people who wrote it down were most likely monks, Christian scribes. They were the literate ones kind of in the Middle Ages, and so they would have been the ones to actually write things down. And so that isn't super plausible. Like, it is one theory, but it's not one that I personally really like. There's another more common theory that the person who wrote it, the Christian elements were kind of there from the get-go, and that ties into sort of the history of the poem, because it probably wasn't an oral poem beforehand, but it probably was inspired by multiple different myths and stories that did exist beforehand. So it was sort of more like a synthesis of pre-existing stories rather than a story that existed. For one thing, we don't have the name Beowulf in anything else before that. It's sort of a character that arises strictly in this poem. And there are some other characters in the poem who are based on either historical people or who are characters in other mythic stories, and so they exist already. And so it seems more like Beowulf is a synthesis of other things that existed, but wasn't necessarily like something that existed before it was written down. So the person who wrote it down was probably either the person who composed it or was very close to the person who composed it and then had it written down shortly after. So it's a long debate, and if you want to study, you know, Old English literature and English history, there's lots of debates online and among scholars about sort of how that came to be, because there are other stories that exist that have similar elements to the Beowulf story, but it's not really a one-to-one perfect match. So take that as you will and explore that on your own, because it's a fun topic. Now, the poem is written in the West Saxon dialect of Old English. West Saxon was the language that would have been spoken by like Alfred the Great. So if you know who that is, kind of the historical English king, very, very old. that's the language that he would have spoken. And there are other sort of variations. I'm going to read an excerpt from the poem in Old English so you can hear what it sounds like. And it's going to be really bad because my pronunciation isn't great, but at least you'll get kind of a sense of what it sounds like. And then I will also put a link to a much better reading on the video here so you can hear a professional person read it and actually get it right. So, all right, here we go. I'm going to try to do this. Hwet, we gardena in jardagum, Theokiniga thrym gefrunan, hutha ethelingas ellen fremedon. Okay, that's terrible. It's so bad. I'm not even going to continue. But I am going to read. There's a line a bit farther down. It's line 11 that if you hear it, it sounds really close to English. And it goes, that was good keening. And that means that was a good king. So you can kind of hear, like the word that is one of those words that has like unchanged since the beginning of the English language. So you can look at the word that and be like, except it was spelled a little bit differently. It was spelled like this. So with the thorn, which is a letter that we need to bring back. We need to bring back thorn. Thorn is very cool, and I miss it. But anyways, so that was terrible, and if you're a scholar, I'm really sorry for butchering that. But Old English is very different from modern English. It's almost a completely different language. It has its own grammar. It is still English, and it's the earliest version of English, but it's very, 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 very different from modern English. But there are still kind of the bits and pieces that mark it as English. Old English is a Germanic language. It arose out of the changes to the languages of the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, which are three different sort of tribes, Germanic tribes, that settled in Britain following the Romans. So after the Romans were there and the language of Britain was Latin. Before that, you've got the Britons, who their language was a Celtic language, and the Latin people, the Romans came in and treated them very badly, and then the Roman Empire sort of started to crumble and fall, and so the Romans pulled out, and then these other tribes moved in, and the language that became English was sort of a melding of a bunch of different languages of these Germanic tribes that sort of mushed together. And there probably was some influence by Latin as well. There is kind of bits in here and there that kind of sound Latin-ish, and maybe some other Celtic influences as well, but for the most part it's very much a Germanic language from like Europe that took over, and it became its own thing. If you hear it now, parts of it sound vaguely like Danish maybe, but it's not related to them as directly as it sounds. So it's like you've got Germanic up here, and then you've got the branch, and then you've got Danish over here, and then you've got Old English over here. There is another language in Scandinavia called Frisian, and Old Frisian was sort of most closely linked to the Anglo-Saxon language that arose out of all of those others. So it is kind of connected, but it's very much its own thing. After the Norman conquest in 1066, then you get French introduced, and by that point, English was very established. And so even though French sort of took over as the lingua franca of England, French combined with Old English, and well, I guess it would have been Old French combined with, or Norman French, combined with Old English, and that combination eventually led to Middle English, which is the language of Chaucer and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And so that is way later. That's like the middle to the end of the Middle Ages. So we're not there yet. We're getting there. But Old English is sort of the earliest version of English that's sort of classified as English. So before that, it would have been like the language of the Angles or the language of the Saxons, and then that combined together to become its own thing. While there are other poems and writings in Old English, Beowulf is sort of a complete text, and it's in phenomenal shape, all things considered, so it's not incorrect to sort of refer to it as the oldest English epic. So it's very important, and I love it a lot. Now, I'm getting into translating Beowulf, so because it's a very different version of English than modern English, translating it into modern English can be tricky because Old English has a different grammar. It's a little bit looser. It uses sort of word endings to sort of conjugate things, and that's kind of different how modern English works. And so you've got a bit of a challenge in translating it. Now, there's some translators who are a little bit more loosey-goosey about it. And I'm going to read a couple translations here so you can hear the differences. Some, like Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, he did a prose translation of it. He also did a verse translation, but he didn't finish it, so it's kind of a fragment that we have. But he did do a prose translation of the whole thing, and I'll read you an excerpt from that. And then we've got others like Charles Kennedy, which is an older translation from the 40s, and that's one of my favorites because it really captures the bounce and feel of the original. The original Old English it's not necessarily iambic pentameter strictly, but it does have that kind of iambic bounce. So yeah, so it does have this kind of ba-dum feel to it. It's not strictly iambic pentameter the way you'd see in like Shakespeare, but it's got that feel. And the way the poem is written, this is what it looks like. I don't know if you can see it. And so there's this gap in the middle, and it's called a caesura. And so you've got the first part and then the second part. So you've got this very distinct rhythm that is difficult to recapture in modern English. And so modern translators have a bit of leeway. There's also something called kennings that are really cool. And this was it's a poetic device where it's sort of like kind of like a metaphor. A really common one is like the whale road to describe the ocean, And the way the reason for doing that is it allows you to maintain the meter and the kind of flow of it without ruining it. So if a word doesn't fit, you can add in sort of this epithet that fits a bit better, and it really gives it a really colorful, unique feel that you don't see. We do see something kind of like this in the Odyssey, where you've got repeated phrases, things like, dawn appeared rosy-fingered, or the wine dark sea, that kind of thing. That's not a kenning, but it's sort of these stock phrases that were used. And in this one, you've got sort of these epithets that are sort of used sometimes repeatedly as a means of like maintaining the rhythm of the poem, but also it's just cool. And also the name of the main character, Beowulf, is kind of a kenning in itself. So the name Beowulf is two words. It's bee and wolf. So Beowulf. That refers to a bear, basically. So it's like the Beowulf is the wolf that goes after bees, because bears like honey. And so you've got, wolf meaning not necessarily just a wolf literally, but just like a big hairy beast, and then, going after bees. So it's an evocative image. So his name is just kind of bear. And if, an analog in Tolkien would be like the character of Beorn from The Hobbit, who turns into a bear, and his name just means bear. So, it's Beowulf is sort of like Bear Man, but not that cheesy. Anyways, I'm getting off topic here. Let me read you a couple examples of different translations so you can kind of see both which ones you like the most if you want to read along. There are lots of free versions of this online, so it's not something you'd ever have to spend money if you want to read along the poem, but just so you can get a sense of sort of what it sounds like and what aspects of it might appeal to you. So let's start with the oldest and then move to the newest. So Charles Kennedy's translation, this is the first one that I actually read in high school, and it's still my favorite. I love the flow and bounce of it. And so I'm going to read the first section here. All right. Lo, we have listened to many a lay of the Spear-Danes' fame, their splendor of old, their mighty princes and martial deeds, many a mead hall, Shield, son of Sheaf, snatched from the forces of savage foes. From a friendless foundling, feeble and wretched, he grew to a terror as time brought change. He throve under heaven in power and pride, till alien peoples beyond the ocean paid toll and tribute, a good king he. So a good king he, that's the line that in the original is, that was good king. Well, that was a good king. So I love this translation so much. It's so good. It's got this great bounce. It's got this very epic feel to it, and it's great. Next up is J.R.R. Tolkien. This is a prose translation, so it's not poetry, and so it's a little bit different. All right, so this is how he says it. Lo, the glory of the kings of the people of the Spear-Danes, in days of old we have heard tell, how those princes did deeds of valor, oft shield-chafing robbed the hosts of foemen, many peoples of the seats where they drank their mead, laid fear upon men. He who first was found forlorn, comfort for that he lived to know, mighty grew under heaven, throve in honor, until all that dwelt nigh about, over the sea where the whale rides, must hearken to him and yield him tribute. A good king was he. So, that's Tolkien. It's a little, not grandiose, but it's got that kind of formal, very Tolkien-ish style. And it flows really well, but there's lots of interjections and digressions because he's not really limited by short poetry like lines. So he's able to kind of go on a little bit, and so it does get a little rambly at times, but I do still like Tolkien's translation. It's really well done, and his use of language is really cool in this one. All right, next up, this is probably the most famous one, and it's probably the easiest one for you to find. Most bookstores carry this one, and that's Seamus Heaney's translation. This one is a little bit controversial because in his translation, Heaney used sort of elements of like Irish dialect in the translation to sort of suggest that Irish had ties to sort of Old English, and it's a very, very different language. And so some people see it as sort of him trying to invent a version of British history where sort of all the languages are unified together in kind of this language. And so it's a little bit controversial for some people, but this is very well regarded. It's very much a masterpiece. A lot of people really like it, and it's very good. So this is how he reads it. So, the Spear-Danes in days gone by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of these princes' heroic campaigns. There was Shield Chiefson, scourge of many tribes, a wrecker of mead benches, rampaging among foes. This terror of the hall troops had come far. A foundling to start with, he would flourish later on, as his powers waxed and his worth was proved. In the end, each clan of the outlying coast beyond the Whale Road had to yield to him and begin to pay tribute. That was one good king. So Heaney's translation is very readable, very accessible. His lines are a little bit longer, but he uses it really well. It's got a good flow, and I really like that. Although he does translate shield sheafing as shield sheafson, which is correct, but I don't know. I kind of like the original shield sheafing because it's cool, but you know, that's fine. He translates the name itself, so it's a lot more readable and it flows really well. So this is a good one if you want kind of an accessible translation that can kind of drag you in without a lot of preamble. Next up is Stephen Mitchell's translation. I really like Stephen Mitchell. He did a good translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he does some fun things with his as well. All right, so this is how he starts it. Of the strength of the Spear-Danes in days gone by, we have heard, and of their hero kings, the prodigious deeds these princes performed. Often shield chafing scattered the ranks of hostile tribes and filled them with terror. He began as a foundling, but flourished later, and grew to glory beneath the sky, until the countries on every coast, over the waves where the whales ride, yielded to him with yearly tribute to keep the peace. He was a good king. This one is very readable as well, and I really like the way that he kind of finds a balance between the really rigid bounce of maybe the older translations and the more looser flow of Seamus Heaney's. And I know that's sort of evil to say because a lot of people hold Seamus Heaney's as sort of the best version, but I really, really like this version. The only thing about this one is that he translates Whale Road as the waves where the whales ride, and it flows well and it's cute, but I don't know, there's something about maintaining those kennings, like the Whale Road, that I think is really cool. But this is still a good translation, very accessible, and this is also an interlinear or a bilingual one. So you have the Old English on this side, and then his translation on the right side, so you can compare the two. Seamus Heaney's also has both translations as well. Finally, this is the newest one. This is Maria Devana Headley's translation. This is the Bro translation. Because of the way that she translates the first word, which is whet, which is sort of hark, low, listen, that kind of thing. It's a hard word to translate, and so Stephen Mitchell doesn't even translate it. He just ignores that word completely, but I think it's a good one. And so this one starts like this. Bro, tell me we still know how to speak of kings. In the old days, everyone knew what men were. Brave, bold, glory-bound. Only stories now, but I'll sound the Speardane song hoarded for hungry times. Their first father was a foundling, shield chafing. He spent his youth fists up, browbeating every barstool brother, bonfiring his enemies. That man began in the waves, a baby in a basket, but he bootstrapped his way into a kingdom, trading loneliness for luxury. Whether they thought kneeling necessary or no, everyone from head to tail of the Whale Road bent down. There's a king, there's his crown. That was a good king. Now, I love this translation. It's so fun. It's got a lot of modern imagery and, modern words, especially like Barstool Brother, but it really captures the feel of the original, and it captures that alliterative feel because it's an alliterative poem. There's lots of alliteration, and so you've got bold, glory bound, or browbeating every barstool brother, bonfiring his enemies, so b b b b b, those repeated sounds, and it's very cool. It's a very like raw dudes rock kind of translation, but it's fun. And if you wanted to get like high school students excited about Beowulf, this is one that I would definitely suggest. This is actually the one that I'm going to be reading while we're doing this run through, because it's so much fun, and there's lots of cool things in here that you wouldn't sort of normally be aware of. So these are the different translations. There's lots of different ways you can approach it. I think if you're looking for something that's more academically accepted, that's terrible, but like more academic, I would say Stephen Mitchell's translation or Seamus Heaney's would be good for that. If you're looking for something that captures the feel of the original, I would say Charles Kennedy's. That's my favorite, and that's what I read in high school, and it was easy to read then. So even though it sounds old-fashioned, it's still something that I think kids could connect with. But this is also a good one for that. So that's Beowulf. That's the introduction. Next week, I'm going to be starting on the beginning of the story. So we've got the fight with Grendel next week. So if you find a copy of it, definitely read it. And if there's other translations that you really like that I didn't mention today, mention them in the comments, because I'd love to hear about other versions, because collecting epic poems is a hobby of mine and I love it so much. So I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.